Is learning Chinese slang worth your time? What do you do when someone with less study time speaks better than you? And how can you escape the expat bubble and start learning Mandarin? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This week's episode is a Q&A focusing on speaking ability. This coincides with this month's challenge, which is also about speaking, and if you're interested in joining, which is completely free, head over to the article linked to in the show notes, where you will find information about the challenge and also some tips and tricks for how to improve your speaking ability. For this Q&A episode, I've selected 3 listener or reader questions. The first one is from Lynn, who wonders what to do if you figure that there are people who speak much better Mandarin than you do, even though they haven't studied as long as you have. The second question is from 666 Llama on YouTube, and yes, I do post these podcast episodes on YouTube as well, and they want to know how to break out of the expat bubble. So they've been living in China for many years, but still don't speak the language and feel rather bad about this. The third question is from Pedro, and it's about learning Chinese slang. Is this something you should do, and if so, how? So those 3 are the questions on the menu for today, and I will address them in the order I just said. So let's start with the first question from Lynn about people speaking better than you do even though they haven't studied as long as you have. This is something I think many learners have experienced, especially if you spend a lot of time online checking out how other people are learning and how quickly they do it. Before we dig into this question, I'd like to point out that learning Chinese is not a race, it is not a competition, so other people performing better than you do is not necessarily bad. I mean, you care about your progress, not their progress, so getting hung up on somebody learning faster than you do is neither healthy nor helpful. Now, just because I say that doesn't mean that people will just stop comparing with others, and I think that's a natural thing to do, it's just that don't obsess over it too much. And as we shall see, there are a couple of things you can actually gain from comparing with others, but that assumes that you're doing a proper comparison, and there are many reasons to believe that most people who compare don't do so properly. There are several potential pitfalls here, so let's have a look at a few of them. The first one is related to how long you've actually studied. Do you know how much time you've spent on Chinese during the time you've studied the language? And do you know how much this other person has spent during the time they've studied? The likely answer is no, you don't know either of those two, and then the comparison is kind of meaningless. What determines how much Chinese we learn is not how much time has elapsed since we started learning, but rather how much we engage with the language during this time. I've made this comparison before on the podcast, but if you compare someone who studies 2 hours a week and does so for normal semesters, such as in high school, and then do that for 6 or 7 years, they will accumulate the same number of hours as someone who studies full-time for 3 months. And now I only counted full-time as being 40 hours, and it's perfectly possible to study twice as much if you include all engagement with the language if you live in an immersion environment, for example. What I'm trying to say here is that 2 people who started learning Chinese a year ago might have very different study backgrounds. One of them might have studied 10 times or 20 or 30 times as much as the other person, and then comparing how much progress they've made makes little sense. Then there are also many other factors that influence how much you learn. For example, what kind of support did you have? What resources do you have? Do you have a teacher? Are you living in an immersion environment? What's your motivation like? And things like that. And these things are very rarely equal between 2 people, so comparing them makes little sense. However, I think that comparing can sometimes be useful, not in the sense that you want to compete with somebody else, but perhaps comparing with somebody else can actually highlight something that you might be doing wrong, or at least some aspect of your learning where there is room for improvement. I usually say that there are 3 factors that determine how much you learn, and you can multiply them together to figure out how much progress you make. And the first factor then is how much time you spend, and this is counted in hours, of course, not in years. Then we have which method you use, how efficient it is, and then finally we have what you're studying, so the content. Now, if we for a moment assume that you've invested the same number of hours as somebody else, but they are still miles ahead of you, it could then be that you are doing something different when it comes to method or content. And since they have learned much more than you, maybe they are doing something that you could mimic and learn from as well. It's important to be mindful of your goals here though, because when you compare, you're usually comparing a specific aspect of language ability, not everything, because that is very hard to test or to compare. As an example, Lynn here specifically asked about speaking, but you could imagine someone who focuses only on the spoken language, and if they invest the same number of hours as somebody who also focuses on the written language, well, they basically have twice as much time to spend on practicing speaking, listening, tones, and so on, and so it's only natural that they will progress faster. But let's assume that you know that you've spent roughly the same amount of time as somebody else on, say, speaking, and your speaking is still far behind theirs. What should you do? Well, I think you should look at what they are studying, the content, and how they are studying it. Maybe there's something you can learn here. Just to bring up an example, if you've been taking Chinese classes, rather traditional one, maybe where most of the teaching is actually in English, and you compare that with someone who has had lessons in Chinese from day one, well, they are going to learn a lot more Chinese than you will, because you are spending most of your time learning about the language, which is not the same as learning the language. There might be some transfer between the two, but it's not obvious that learning about a grammar rule, for example, in English, actually teaches you how to use this. And listening to a teacher explaining the difference between two similar words might not help you that much when it comes to actually using these words. We tend to think, students tend to think that language learning is explicit. We teach something and then the students learn that, but this is not how it works. Language learning is largely implicit. So the point here is that if you feel that you are way behind somebody, look at what they're doing and compare that with what you are doing and see if there's something you can learn. So for example then, if you are studying Chinese largely in English by watching videos on YouTube where people speak English, explaining things in Chinese to you, or you have classes where you speak mostly English, and this other person who has progressed very quickly seems to be doing everything in Chinese, well, this might be a hint that there is a better way of doing things. So you could also learn faster if you focused more on the Chinese language and learned in Chinese rather than in English. This question was actually discussed in detail in episode 64 of the podcast, where we talked about why your Chinese isn't as good as you think it ought to be, which is essentially a different way of phrasing Lynn's question here. Okay, let's move on to question 2, which is from Lama, and they have been living in China for many years, but don't speak the language, and they feel rather bad about this. And what should they do? How can they break out of the expat bubble and start learning Mandarin? So first things first, I don't think that you should feel bad about not having learned Chinese even though you lived in China. This is extremely common, and it's not just in China. I know many people here in Sweden who have moved here for work, for example, and they work largely in English, and some of them haven't learned a word of Swedish. Well, okay, that's an exaggeration. They will learn things like greetings and simple phrases and so on, but I'm sure that somebody who has lived in China for many years know a few phrases as well. The step from doing that to actually speaking the language, though, is pretty big. It is a major commitment, and it's not something that just happens automatically. Sure, if you tell someone you've been living in China for 5 years, they will sometimes assume that you know how to speak the language, because we have this myth going that if you live in a country, you will just magically absorb the language, which is not true, and this is a good example of that. But the point is that we know that simply living in China does not teach you Chinese. This is a major commitment. It will require time and effort. I know that you know this, but I think it's important to not feel bad about this. The best time to plant a tree was maybe 20 years ago, but the second best time to do it is now, and postponing it won't make it better. So what you can do today is make decisions that mean that in 5 years you will not look back at this 5-year period and say, well, I should have done something else. Maybe I should have learned more Chinese. So what are some decisions you can make, or some things you can do to get started? And getting started is the most important thing. It doesn't matter exactly what you do or what method you use and so on, just do something. It's important to start regarding yourself as someone who is learning Mandarin and establish habits that will allow you to do that. This means at a very minimum that you should find something you can listen to that makes sense and is relatively interesting, and I have recommendations for that, and I'll put links to that in the show notes. If you're interested in the written language, well, then you should obviously also read things, and I'll put links to beginner-friendly reading materials as well. I would also advise you to find one patient native speaker who is willing to talk to you in Chinese at your level. Ideally, this would be someone with training and experience and who's good at talking to beginners in Chinese without resorting to English too much, but this is probably something you have to pay for unless you're very lucky. If you're not in a position to hire one, all you actually need is a native speaker who is relatively friendly and patient. They should be willing to speak Chinese with you, even though it will take time for you to express yourself, and even if they might have to repeat themselves or paraphrase what they just said many times before you understand. It's also important that you find someone who will make your practice feel good. And when I say good here, I don't mean that it will be relaxing and smooth, because it won't. It will be taxing and exhausting. But you should feel encouraged to use Chinese and look forward to these sessions, even if they are tiring. If you've been living in China for many years, it's also likely that you know many native speakers, even though you might be speaking English with them. So simply letting them know that you want to learn Chinese might work here. Some of them might not be too interested in helping you out, but others will. So to summarize, don't feel too bad about your situation. Start by finding listening materials you can make sense of and engage with those, and reading materials if you want to learn the written language, and then pair this with some kind of engagement in Chinese, a conversation with a friendly native speaker or teacher. Then, as you build momentum, you can gradually diversify and use different methods for learning, including all the things I talk about on this podcast and on Hacking Chinese. If you want specific guidance for beginners, you can always check out my course Unlocking Chinese, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So good luck, 加油, and let's move on to question number 3. This one is from Pedro, who wants to know my opinion about learning slang in Chinese. This is something that many learners are interested in, and I'm not going to speculate why that's the case, but if you go to YouTube, for example, you will see that most content creators have videos about slang. But is slang really that useful for language learners? Well, not so much in my humble opinion. And yes, if you're terribly interested in it, I'm not saying that you should stay away from it. I'm just saying if you're evaluating slang from a usefulness perspective, no, it's like any other low-frequency vocabulary. In essence, there's almost always other words that you should learn before you learn slang expressions, because they are used more widely, can apply to more situations, and just improve your ability to communicate in Chinese much more than any slang expression or word would. There are exceptions to this, such as when some slang expressions become so common that you hear them all over the place, and if you don't know what it means, it's a bit hard to communicate. But that's not something you need to really focus on, because if that happens, you will learn these expressions anyway. You don't need to go and look them up on YouTube and study them. The problem with slang is that it's limited in several senses that most other words are not. And let's look at a few of those to show you what I mean. First, slang expressions become old very fast, so learning slang from 5 years ago might not be very useful, and even worse, learning something from, say, 20 years ago might be completely useless because these expressions are no longer used. Compare this with the core vocabulary of the language, which will certainly not go out of fashion in just 20 years. Next, slang is also limited by region. If you learn something in northern China, maybe that is not used in southern China or in overseas communities or what have you. Compare this again with the core vocabulary of the language, which is likely to be understood and used more widely. Then we also have different slang in different social groups. For example, young people use different slang from older people. People online in different communities there also use different slang. And if you learn something in one of these communities and then try to use it somewhere else, it's not a guarantee that people will even understand what you mean. And so prioritizing slang over core vocabulary in the language is not a good idea if communicative ability is what you're after. Finally, slang is also limited by age, and you can just think of this in your native language. People of different age groups are used to different types of slang, and people from different generations might not even understand each other's slang. Okay, so I realize that this answer is pretty boring, but if you evaluate slang simply from how useful it is, you need to be in a very specific situation for it to make sense to focus on slang explicitly, to actually study it. What you should do instead in most cases is simply absorb it naturally. If there are slang expressions that people around you use, you will pick them up, or you can notice them first and then learn them as you encounter them in real life. And this is quite different from finding a list online or going to YouTube and finding a video where somebody goes through, 8 must-know Chinese slang words or something like that. This is actually solid advice for learning vocabulary in general. Focus on the words and expressions that you encounter when you read and listen and learn those. And if you don't have enough vocabulary to learn, it simply means that you're not listening and reading enough. This is much better than learning vocabulary from lists, which is something we discussed in episode 140 if you want more about that. Okay, I think that means we've answered the 3 questions that were the focus of this episode. If you have any questions about learning Chinese, feel free to reach out and I might feature your question in an upcoming episode. In the meantime, don't forget to check out the speaking challenge and I'll see you there. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.